They called it a tragedy at first, a family of four struck down in their own kitchen, a supper gone suddenly horribly wrong. Neighbors whispered about gas leaks, food poisoning, a terrible accident no one could have predicted. And in the middle of the sorrow stood a girl, 15 years old, her eyes wide with grief, her hands trembling as she told police what she had seen. She became the town's symbol of loss, the survivor the child fate had spared. People brought her casseroles, hugged her shoulders, assured her she was not alone. Teachers whispered prayers in classrooms, church pews filled with voices asking for mercy on her soul. For weeks, she lived under a halo of sympathy. Everyone believed she was innocent, that she was another victim of some cruel twist of fortune. But here's the truth. There are no halos in this story, only smoke, mirrors, and poison. Because Emily, quiet Emily from the Midwest, was not merely unlucky. She was not a bystander. She was the one who stirred the stew, the one who watched as her parents grew pale and her brother clutched his stomach. She was the reason the ambulances screamed through town that night, and she was the only one who knew from the first bite that none of them would walk away. This is her story, a story of love that twisted into conspiracy, of a teenage girl who decided freedom was worth more than blood. As we peel back the layers, her school days, her secret meetings with an older boy, the whispers that turned into plans, you will see how a child who looked like any other could transform into something far more dangerous. So, let me ask you before we begin. If you were sitting at that table, would you have noticed? Would you have seen the flicker of calculation behind her smile? Or would you, like everyone else in that town, have believed you were looking at the face of innocence? Tell me in the comments what you think. Are monsters made by their homes, or do they already exist inside, waiting for a moment to strike? And if you want to uncover every shadow in this story, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Emily grew up on a quiet street where porches sagged beneath the weight of old rocking chairs, and mailboxes leaned against wooden posts. It was the kind of place where everyone knew whose dog barked at night, where gossip traveled faster than the mail, and where children were expected to say yes ma'am and no sir without hesitation. For outsiders, this small town in the Midwest seemed almost untouched by time, safe, predictable, decent. Inside her own home, appearances were kept polished, just like the neat front yard and the trimmed hedges. Her father, a factory worker with calloused hands and a voice that carried authority, believed discipline was the anchor of family life. Rules were firm, consequences swift. Her mother, practical and sharp-eyed, ran the household with the precision of a clock. She demanded order, respect, and quiet obedience. To the neighbors, they were the model of working-class integrity. To Emily, they were walls closing in. At school, she blended in as just another sophomore in oversized sweaters and faded jeans. She was polite to teachers, courteous to classmates, and never once found herself in detention. To most, she was invisible in the best sense. Safe, predictable, decent, just like the town itself. But Emily was not invisible to herself. Beneath the surface, she nursed a private ache, the sense that she was meant for something larger than homework and chores. Books became her first escape. She devoured dog-eared romance novels borrowed from the library, pages filled with passionate declarations and reckless choices. In those stories, girls like her broke free from stern parents in quiet towns. They ran toward adventure, toward love, toward anything that felt alive. Each chapter planted a seed. If they could do it, why couldn't she? By the time she turned 15, that seed had sprouted into a restless yearning. Emily felt suffocated at the dinner table during Sunday sermons, even walking home along familiar streets. The same conversations, the same expectations, the same life stretched ahead, like an endless road, with no turns. And somewhere inside her a thought took root, dangerous, fragile, but growing stronger every day. She would not be trapped forever. The town saw only a sweet, quiet girl. They never noticed the way her gaze lingered beyond the horizon, or the subtle impatience in her voice when she promised to finish her chores. They did not see the private diary entries where she wrote of freedom, of escape, of a love that might one day carry her far away. It was in that restless state of mind that she first met Jake, and everything in her life began to shift. Jake was the kind of boy every parent in town warned their daughters about. He was 18, old enough to be considered a man, but young enough to still burn with the recklessness of youth. He worked at the gas station on the edge of town, where the neon sign buzzed at night and engines coughed beneath his hands. Grease stained his jeans, cigarettes dangled from his lips, and there was always a rumor following behind him like a shadow. Some said he had been caught shoplifting once. Others swore he had been in fights behind the high school. Jim. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. The image was already cemented. To adults, Jake was trouble. To girls like Emily, he was a spark in a town that otherwise felt colorless. Their first meeting was nothing extraordinary. Emily stopped at the station with her mother one afternoon, standing by as gas pumped into their car. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and offered a lopsided smile. His eyes lingered on Emily a second longer than polite, and she felt her chest tighten with something unfamiliar. In that fleeting exchange, she saw everything she thought she wanted. Freedom, rebellion, possibility. It began innocently enough. She started walking by the station after school, pretending to browse the candy aisle or linger at the magazine rack. Jake noticed, of course. He always noticed. Soon they were talking, first about trivial things, then about her life, her family, the way she felt trapped. He listened with the kind of attention she never received at home. Where her parents scolded, Jake encouraged. Where her teachers saw another quiet student, Jake claimed he saw something special. Emily's diary, once filled with half-formed daydreams, now carried his name across its pages. Jake became her secret, the bright thread in a tapestry of monotony. But secrets in small towns are fragile things, and soon her parents learned of her visits. The confrontation was swift and merciless. Her father thundered that Jake was no good. Her mother called him a danger. The rules tightened. Curfews became stricter. Errands monitored. Emily was warned that she was forbidden to see him again. To the parents, it was protection. To Emily, it was a prison tightening around her heart. The more they forbade her, the more she clung to Jake. Their meetings grew clandestine. Stolen moments behind the station, whispered conversations in shadowed corners. He became the only place where she could breathe, the only person who seemed to understand. And as her devotion deepened, Jake's influence over her grew, feeding a reckless dream that together they could escape everything holding them down. It was in those hushed encounters beneath the hum of street lamps and the distant echo of train whistles that a darker idea first began to take shape. The more Emily slipped away to meet Jake, the more she felt the weight of her family's rules pressing down upon her. At home, every glance from her father seemed like a judgment. Every word from her mother carried suspicion. Chores multiplied, questions sharpened, and freedom shrank until her world felt no larger than the walls of her bedroom. Jake became her only release. In his company, the air was different, looser, charged, alive. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had already chosen rebellion over obedience, and he wore his disdain for authority like a badge. Emily soaked in his words as if they were gospel, her heart beating faster each time he told her she deserved more than what she had. One evening, sitting in the cab of his battered pickup truck, Jake lit a cigarette and exhaled into the night. The glow of the street lamp caught the sharp angles of his face as he turned toward her. "They'll never let you go," he said. "Not really. You'll always be their little girl locked up in that house, following their rules." Emily stared out the window, fighting the lump in her throat. She wanted to argue, to insist that someday she would be old enough to leave on her own, but the words felt hollow. Jake pressed on. "Jake, do you want to be stuck there forever? Do you want them deciding every choice for you until you can't breathe?" She shook her head slowly, his voice lowered, almost a whisper. "There are ways out, Emily. People make choices every day to break free. Some just don't have the courage to do it." The words lingered long after he dropped her off that night. They echoed in her head while she washed dishes, while she folded laundry, while she listened to her parents' arguments. She told herself he didn't mean anything specific. It was just talk. But deep down, a door had been opened, and once opened, it could not be shut. The next time they met, the conversation grew bolder. Jake spoke of couples who ran away together, stories he claimed to have heard about people disappearing to start fresh somewhere else. He painted pictures of distant cities with glowing lights and freedom in every corner. Emily hung on his every word, her imagination soaring, but always behind the daydreams lay the same quiet suggestion: escape would come at a cost. It was never said outright, never pressed upon her like a command. But Jake's eyes held a question, unspoken yet clear. How far was she willing to go for love, for freedom, for him? That night, lying awake in her small bedroom while the house settled into silence, Emily stared at the ceiling and felt a chill. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder not just if she could leave, but if she could live in a world without them. Once the thought had taken root, it grew with frightening speed. At first, Emily tried to push it aside, convincing herself it was only a passing fantasy. But each time her father's voice thundered across the dinner table, or her mother's sharp eyes caught her lingering too long by the window, the fantasy crept back stronger than before. And whenever she met Jake, he watered that seed with quiet, deliberate words. It began with questions. What would it be like if it were just the two of us? He asked one afternoon, leaning against a gas pump while Emily lingered at his side. Imagine no one telling you when to come home. No one checking your phone. No one standing between us. Emily's heart, said as she pictured it. No rules, no curfews, no scolding, just freedom, just Jake. Soon the questions became possibilities. Jake mentioned stories he had read in old magazines, tales of people slipping away, of lovers vanishing into new lives. Then, almost casually, he began to speak of methods. Some people just walk away, he said. Others, they make sure nothing holds them back. Emily asked what he meant, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested he knew more than he was saying. The subject of poison surfaced one evening in the most ordinary of places, the library. Emily had gone there under the pretense of studying, but Jake had followed, and together they browsed the dusty shelves. In the back, beneath sagging encyclopedias, they found manuals on household safety, guides on farming, and pamphlets about rodent control. Jake pointed to a passage about arsenic, once used in pesticides, his finger tracing the page. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Later, in the dim glow of the truck's dashboard, Jake spoke more plainly. It wouldn't have to be messy, he said. No screens, no fights. Just quiet. A meal, a drink, and then freedom. Emily shivered at his words, torn between terror and exhilaration. To imagine such a thing was unthinkable, and yet the image filled her mind with a dangerous clarity. She didn't answer, but Jake didn't need her to. The silence between them was enough. Over the following weeks, they began to collect fragments of knowledge, piecing together a grim puzzle. Jake claimed he knew where to buy rat poison without drawing suspicion. Emily, who often accompanied her mother to the feed store outside town, realized she could make the purchase herself. A plan unspoken but undeniable was beginning to form between them. At home she moved carefully, hiding her thoughts behind practiced smiles. Her parents' bell eaved. The rules were working, that the walls they had built around her were holding firm. They never saw the cracks spreading quietly beneath their feet. For Emily, the fantasy was no longer just an escape. It was becoming a strategy. The purchase itself was easier than Emily had imagined. On a gray Saturday morning, her mother drove her out to the feed store beyond the cornfields, the kind of place where farmers bought sacks of grain and tools that smelled of rust and oil. While her mother browsed for laundry, soap, and flour, Emily wandered to the back aisle where shelves carried pest control products. The box looked ordinary, bright packaging promising to rid barns of rodents. Its warning labels were small, the kind most people never bothered to read. But Emily's hands trembled as she reached for it, slipping it into the basket beneath a cover of household goods. At the counter, the clerk didn't even glance twice. To him, she was just another teenager running errands for her mother. Back home, Emily smuggled the package upstairs, tucking it deep inside her school backpack. Each time she opened the zipper, the sight of it made her heart pound. She told herself it was just preparation, not commitment, but deep down she knew the line had been crossed. Jake's reaction when she showed him was a crooked grin. He held the box as though it were a prize, shaking it gently before tucking it into his jacket. "See," he said, "no one suspects a thing. They'll never see it coming." But theory wasn't enough. Jake insisted they needed proof. Proof that the poison worked, that their plan wasn't just whispers in the dark. So, one evening behind the station, he poured a portion of the powder into a dish of milk and set it beside the dumpster. A stray cat, thin and skittish, approached and lapped at the surface. Emily turned away before the end, pressing her palms against her ears. When she finally looked back, the silence of the alley told her what she didn't want to admit. The image haunted her all night. She woke sweating, convinced she had heard the pitiful cry of the animal echoing in her room. She told herself it was just practice, just a test, but she also knew the next test would not be so easily dismissed. Jake, on the other hand, seemed emboldened. "Now we know," he said simply. "It works. All that's left is timing." In her diary, Emily wrote pages of conflicting thoughts. Guilt nodded at her, but alongside it came a sense of inevitability. Each day at home felt heavier, each argument sharper. She no longer asked herself whether the plan was possible. She asked when the poison was no longer hidden in a backpack. It was hidden in her heart, and it would not stay there forever. The night arrived with the ordinary calm of a Midwest weekend. The sky stretched low and heavy, clouds rolling like slow waves over the fields. Inside the small house, the rhythm of family life continued as it always had. Her father returning from the factory, his boots left at the door, her mother bustling in the kitchen, humming to herself as she stirred the stew pot, her younger brother darting between rooms, his laughter echoing through the hall. To anyone else, it was a picture of normally. To Emily, it felt like the final act of a play she had rehearsed in secret. She stood in the kitchen doorway, hands trembling at her sides, watching as her mother turned her back to reach for the spice rack. In that moment, Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She slipped the packet from her pocket, a small cloud of pale granules sliding into the steaming pot. The hiss of boiling broth swallowed the sound. She stirred quickly, the spoon clattering against the sides, her breath shallow as though the very walls were listening. Her mother turned back, none the wiser, and smiled. Ed at her daughter. "Help me set the table, will you?" Emily nodded, her throat dry, and carried plates to the dining room. Each step felt like walking across thin ice. The ordinary clatter of silverware seemed deafening, as though every fork placed upon the table accused her. When the family gathered, the air was filled with the sense of warm bread and savory stew. Her father ladled generous portions, her mother poured water into glasses, her brother grinned and asked if dessert would follow. Emily lowered her gaze, her spoon poised above her bowl. The first bite passed her father's lips without suspicion. Her mother followed, then her brother, cheerful as always. Emily raised her spoon but barely tasted the broth. Each swallow around the table felt like a countdown, and with every passing second, the weight of her choice pressed harder against her chest. Conversation stumbled first. Her father coughed, setting down his spoon with a frown. Her brother shifted in his chair, a hand pressed against his stomach. Her mother glanced between them, confusion flickering into alarm. "Are you all right?" she asked, but her voice cracked as though she already knew the answer. Emily forced her eyes wide, feigning panic. She reached for her brother's arm, calling his name, her voice shrill with performance. The scene dissolved into chaos. Her father gasping, her mother rushing to the sink, her brother doubling over. And all the while, Emily clutched at her chest, a mask of terror fixed to her face. Outside, the night remained silent, unaware that within those walls, innocence had been shattered forever. The kitchen became a scene of confusion and terror within minutes. Chairs scraped against the floor as her father struggled to stand, one hand clutching the edge of the table, while the other pressed against his chest. Her mother's voice rose in sharp cries, desperate and helpless. As she tried to steady him, Emily's younger brother moaned, his small body curled in pain, his face pale as wax. Emily's scream pierced the house high and frantic, echoing across the quiet street. Neighbors would later recall hearing it, so raw, so convincing that they rushed to their porches, wondering what nightmare had unfolded next door. The phone call for help was swift, her mother's trembling voice spilling incoherent words into the receiver. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air, drawing closer, louder, until red and blue lights spilled across the walls. Paramedics flooded the doorway, carrying stretchers, their boots heavy on the linoleum. Questions shot across the room. What happened? What did they eat? How long ago? But no answers came clearly. Emily clutched her brother's hand, her eyes wide, her voice breaking, with sobs as she told them she didn't know. She didn't understand. She had only taken a few bites herself. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting bodies, securing oxygen masks, injecting fluids. Her father groaned, her brother whimpered, her mother's lips moved in broken prayers. The smell of antiseptic mingled with the fading aroma of stew, and in that mixture lay the death of a family dinner and the birth of a crime no one yet suspected. As the stretchers rolled out to the waiting ambulances, neighbors gathered on the lawn, murmuring with concern. They saw Emily stumble into the night air, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clung to a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders. To them, she was the picture of heartbreak, the lone survivor of a mysterious tragedy. No one questioned why her steps were steady despite the chaos. No one noticed how her eyes, though red with tears, flickered with something colder just beneath the surface. When the ambulances sped away, sirens fading into the distance, Emily stood in the flashing lights, a girl orphaned by fate, or so everyone believed. In the days that followed, grief hung over the small town like a heavy fog. The factory where her father had worked lowered its flag to half-mast. The church bells tolled in solemn rhythm. At the high school, teachers led students in whispered prayers, their voices trembling as they spoke of loss too cruel to comprehend. Emily walked among them as a figure draped in sorrow. Everywhere she went, arms reached for her shoulders, voices murmured words of comfort. Neighbors brought steaming casseroles, pies still warm from the oven, envelopes of money tucked into greeting cards. At night, families gathered in living rooms, speaking softly about the tragedy, shaking their heads at the injustice of it all. She played her role with chilling perfection. At the funeral, she stood by the coffins with her hands folded neatly, her face pale and stray with tears. She leaned into embraces, nodded through condolences, whispered thank yous with a voice fragile as glass. Reporters snapped photographs, capturing the image of a child robbed of her family, a lone figure against the backdrop of black-clad mourners. To the community, she was not a suspect, but a symbol, a survivor fate had spared. Teachers checked in on her. Classmates wrote notes of encouragement, and the pastor spoke of her resilience as a lesson for all. The town rallied around her, building her a cocoon of sympathy so tight that no one thought to question it. But beneath the veil of grief, Emily carried the weight of a secret. Each night alone in her room, she opened her diary and stared at the pages filled with Jake's name. Freedom, she had written. Escape together. The words no longer read like daydreams. They were the reality she had forged. The truth only she and Jake shared. When she met him in secret, their conversations were quieter now, edged with tension. He reminded her to stay calm, to keep her story simple. "You're the victim," he whispered. "Everyone believes you. Just don't slip." Emily nodded, though sometimes the enormity of it pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. She told herself it had been necessary, that the life she wanted was now within reach. Yet in quiet moments, when a neighbor hugged her too tightly, or when her brother's empty chair caught her eye, doubt crept in like a shadow she could never quite escape. Still, the town adored her, shielded her, trusted her, and for a time it seemed the mask would hold. For a while, the tragedy seemed destined to be written off as a mystery without answers. Perhaps food poisoning, perhaps a contamination no one could explain. But science, unlike sympathy, is not so easily deceived. The pathologists at the county lab began their work in silence, examining tissue samples and stomach contents under the cold light of microscopes. What they found unsettled them. Traces of compounds far too potent to be the result of spoiled food. These were chemicals consistent with rodenticide, substances never meant for human consumption. Their report spoke not of accident, but of intent. The discovery did not reach the town immediately. The investigators kept their circle tight, sharing findings only with the lead detective assigned to the case. He was a man seasoned by years of routine crime, petty thefts, bar fights, the occasional burglary. A suspected poisoning was something different, something rare, and if poison was involved, then someone had placed it there. Meanwhile, Emily carried on her performance. She attended school sporadically, her teachers excusing her absences with sympathetic nods. She accepted gifts from neighbors, stood politely when reporters asked for statements, and always kept her answers short. To Mo, Saint, she seemed the perfect image of a grieving daughter. But perfection has a way of drawing too much light, and in that brightness, shadows begin to show. Detectives quietly combed through the family home. They found no spoiled cans, no broken seals, nothing that could explain the presence of poison. What they did find, tucked away in Emily's desk drawer, was a journal. At first, its pages seemed harmless. Doodles, homework notes, fragments of teenage thoughts. But as they read further, the words grew darker. I dream of freedom. One entry read, "Someday it will just be me and Jake, no one to stop us." Another passage dated only weeks before the tragedy chilled them further. I don't know if I can stand this anymore. Something has to change. The entries were not confessions, but they were enough to raise suspicion. Combined with the lab results, the picture shifted. The girl once seen as a victim now appeared, at least faintly, as a possibility someone investigators could not rule out. And then came the feed store clerk, who remembered selling rat poison to a young girl with nervous eyes. He could not swear to her name, but his description matched Emily closely enough to make the detective's pulse quicken. For the first time, the question whispered among investigators was no longer, what happened to this family? It was, who wanted them gone? The detective who had taken charge of the case was not quick to accuse. In towns like his, rushing to judgment meant breaking fragile trust with neighbors who still believed in handshakes and Sunday sermons. But the evidence gnawed at him, demanding attention. Poison did not fall into stew pots by accident. Diaries did not fill themselves with fantasies of escape, and children did not usually walk away from tragedies without a scratch. He began where suspicion seemed most natural. Emily's circle. There wasn't much of one. She kept two. Herself at school, spoke politely to teachers, and spent most evenings at home. But whispers surfaced soon enough, carried by students who had seen her loitering near the gas station, leaning too close to a boy older than she was. Jake. The name came up again and again, always in the same hushed tone reserved for troublemakers. The detective paid a visit to the station. Jake was there wiping grease from his hands, his smirk barely concealed. When asked about Emily, he played dumb at first, but his eyes betrayed him, flickers of recognition, the faintest spark of pride. He insisted they were just friends, that he had nothing to do with the tragedy. But when pressed about the nights they spent together, his story shifted, inconsistent in small but telling ways. Meanwhile, evidence tightened around them. The feed store clerk recalled with more certainty now that the nervous girl who had purchased poison had been accompanied by another figure, a young man who lingered near the counter. Camera footage from the dusty corner of the store confirmed it, grainy but clear enough to reveal Emily and Jake standing side by side. The detective returned to Emily with careful questions. At first, she answered with the same practiced grief, her voice soft, her eyes wet, but when asked about Jake, her composure faltered. She denied seeing him after her parents had forbidden it, but the surveillance footage told another story. The contradictions began to pile up. Witnesses remembered them together late at night, leaning close under the street lamps. A classmate recalled overhearing Emily whisper about leaving town, about being free. None of it was damning on its own, but woven together, the threads formed a tapestry no longer of innocence, but of conspiracy. The town, still wrapped in sympathy, knew nothing of these discoveries. To them, Emily remained the girl fate had cursed. But, within the walls of the police station, the truth was sharpening like a blade, and the detective could not shake the feeling that Jake was not merely her companion, but her accomplice. The police decided it was time to separate the two. Jake was brought in first, led into a small interview room with peeling paint and a flickering light above. He sat with his arms crossed, defiant at the start, insisting he had nothing to say. But hours wear on a man differently than they do a child. By the third round of questioning, his bravado began to slip. The detectives showed him the footage from the feed store. They laid out the receipts, the journal pages, the medical reports. Piece by piece, the walls closed in until his silence became heavier than words. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling smoke from the cigarette they had offered him, and spoke. "She wanted out," he muttered. "She said she couldn't live with them anymore. I went along." It was a half-confession, an attempt to shift blame, to cast himself as an accessory rather than a mastermind. He painted Emily as the driving force, the one who had carried the poison, the one who stirred the pot. He admitted enough to lighten his own shadow, leaving the rest to fall on her shoulders. When Emily was called in, she entered with the same mask she had worn since the tragedy. Wide eyes, trembling hands, the picture of grief. But the detectives were no longer swayed. They pressed harder, their questions precise, relentless. "Why were you seen with Jake after your parents forbade it? Why does the feed store clerk remember you? Why does your diary speak of freedom, of escape?" Her answers wavered. She denied. She deflected. She cried. But each denial cracked beneath the weight of evidence, and then they told her what Jake had said. The color drained from her face. She shook her head furiously, insisting it wasn't true, that he was lying to protect himself. But her voice rose too high, her tears came too fast. The performance that had fooled an entire town began to unravel under the harsh light of interrogation. One detective leaned across the table, his voice low but steady. "Emily, this is your chance. If you don't tell the truth now, Jake's story will be the only one anyone believes." For the first time, silence filled the room. She stared at her hands, her knuckles white, her lips trembling. Words hovered on the edge, ready to spill, but fear held them back. It was the beginning of her undoing. For hours, Emily resisted. She clung to tears, to trembling hands, to the fragile role of a child swept into disaster. But the room was unyielding, the detectives patient. Each time she denied, they returned with Jake's words. Each time she cried, they pressed with the evidence, the poison, the diary, the surveillance. The silence grew longer, her sobs quieter, until finally she seemed to collapse into herself. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I just wanted it to stop too." The detectives leaned forward. Slowly, haltingly, she began to unravel the truth. She spoke of nights in Jake's truck, the whispered promises, the intoxicating vision of freedom. She described slipping the poison into her pocket at the store, hiding it beneath her school books, hearing it rattle softly as she climbed the stairs. She confessed to the cat, the test that had haunted her dreams. She described the stew, the steam rising from the pot, her mother's back turned for only a moment, the spoon in her hand, the powder dissolving, her pulse thundering as though the whole world could hear. At times her words faltered, choked by sobs. At others she grew strangely steady, almost detached, as though recounting a story she had read rather than lived. The detectives exchanged glances. Here was not only gray, but calculation. A child, yes, but one who had plotted, prepared, executed. One detective asked quietly, "Did you think of what would happen to them?" "To your brother," Emily hesitated. Her eyes flickered, but no tears came. "I thought it would be quick. I thought I had to, or I'd never be free." The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. This was no accident, no tragic twist of fate. It was intent, spoken aloud from the lips of the girl the town had mourned and pied. When the statement was signed, the detective sat in silence for a long while, staring at the papers on the table. The image of Emily as a grieving daughter had shattered completely. What remained was something far more unsettling, the face of a child who had chosen death for those who loved her most. The trial drew crowds unlike anything the small courthouse had ever seen. Reporters from across the state lined the steps, their cameras flashing as spectators pressed close, eager for a glimpse of the girl whose face had graced so many sympathetic headlines only weeks before. Emily, once the town's symbol of sorrow, now entered in handcuffs, her hair tied back, her gaze lowered beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The prosecution painted her as calculating, cold, and deliberate. They spoke of the poison purchased in secret, the diary entries of longing for escape, the test on the stray cat. Piece by piece, they laid out a narrative of intent, stripping away any illusion that tragedy had struck by chance. The defense clung to her age, her vulnerability, the influence of Jake. They argued she was a child caught in the orbit of an older boy, manipulated by promises she was too young to question. They described her as lost, desperate, incapable of fully grasping the weight of her actions. Witnesses were called. The feed store clerk pointed to her as the girl who had stood at his counter, though his voice shook under the gravity of it. Classmates recounted seeing her with Jake, whispering of running away. Detectives detailed the confession, the evidence, the cold logic behind her words. Emily sat through it all in silence. At times, tears streamed down her face. At others, her expression hardened, lips pressed tight, as though she refused to give the court the satisfaction of watching her crumble. The townspeople filled the gallery day after day, torn between disbelief and fury. Many still struggled to reconcile the image of the girl they had comforted with the monster described at trial. Mothers held their own children closer, whispers spreading that if someone like Emily could turn, perhaps anyone could. Outside the courthouse, debates raged. Should a 15-year-old be tried as an adult? Could someone so young truly comprehend murder? Some called for mercy, citing her age and Jake's influence. Others demanded the harshest punishment, arguing that her youth made the crime all the more chilling. The media seized on every detail, the trembling of her hands, the tilt of her chin, the faintest flicker in her eyes. Headlines screamed of betrayal, of innocence lost, of a community forever scarred. And when closing arguments rang out, the question left hanging in the air was not whether Emily had done it. The evidence had spoken, but what her fate should be. Was she to be remembered as a misguided child led astray, or as a cold-blooded killer who had hidden her malice behind a mask of youth? The jury deliberated for hours, their voices muffled behind heavy doors. Outside, the courthouse lawn filled with restless spectators, some clutching prayer books, others holding signs demanding justice. When the jurors finally returned, the room fell into a silence so deep that every cough, every scrape of the chair seemed magnified. The verdict was read in a steady voice. Guilty. The word rang through the chamber like the toll of a bell. Emily's shoulders tensed, her eyes fixed on the floor. But she did not cry. The judge, a man with decades on the bench, spoke with measured gravity. He acknowledged her youth, but could not ignore the deliberation behind her actions, the premeditation, the chilling confession. She would not walk free into adulthood. Instead, she was sentenced to remain in custody through her juvenile years and beyond, transferred later to serve a term in the state prison system. It was a punishment that balanced her age with the enormity of her crime, though to many it felt either too harsh or far too lenient. The courtroom erupted with reactions, gasps, murmurous sobs. Some shook their heads in disbelief, unwilling to accept that the girl they had once embraced as a victim was now condemned as a killer. Others whispered that justice had been done, though even in victory, their voices carried unease. Reporters rushed to file their stories, headlines already forming. Midwest teen found guilty, and family poisoning. From orphan to killer, the Emily case. The tale would ripple far beyond the small town, fueling debates about juvenile justice, parental control, and the terrifying possibility of malice behind innocent faces. As deputies led her from the courtroom, Emily paused only once. She turned her head toward the gallery, her expression calm, almost serene. For a fleeting moment, the room caught her gaze, those wide, unblinking eyes set in a face still soft with youth. And in that silence, an entire community felt a chill. It was not the verdict that haunted them most. It was the realization that beneath the ordinary surface of their town, beneath the familiar rhythms of family life, a child had harbored the will to destroy everything she had known. Long after the trial ended, people would recall that image, a teenage girl walking out of the courtroom in shackles, her expression unreadable, her innocence gone forever. It was a reminder that evil does not always arrive at a stranger's face. Sometimes it grows quietly at the dinner table, smiling, waiting until the moment it decides to strike.